Mhm.
Okay. So, hello everyone. So I'm Tommy Blanchard. I write the Cognitive Wonderland uh, Substack, and I'm joined by I'll try the German way, Walter Veit, uh, um, who is also a Substack writer, but also a philosopher. He's a philosophy professor, has written a copious amount of academic work. So I think over 100 academic articles and 3 books. You also have a YouTube podcast, all kinds of stuff. You're very prolific. Um, and we're here today to talk about a little bit about metaphilosophy, and also your views on kind of taking an evolutionary approach to understanding consciousness. And I should just like shout out one of your books that we're going to be talking about is this one, A Philosophy for the Science of Animal Consciousness. Great book. But just a shout out to people should
Yeah, thanks so
go and
much
buy.
for having me.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I wanted to start things off just kind of light, getting to know you a little bit about your background. How did you get into philosophy, and especially how did you get into the area of specialization, kind of the philosophy of mind slash biology, I guess.
Sure, sure. It depends how detailed you want to go, but when I was in school, I read some philosophy as a kind of a hobby activity, as some might do. But then one day, a teacher came in to our classroom and said that she wanted to offer a philosophy class for a term. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. That's different from what's usually offered. In Italian schools, I think philosophy education is very common. Germany, not so much. I was very much hooked. I got great grades. And I was like, oh, man, I wish you could have a career in philosophy. I didn't really think this was something I was going to do in the future. The school I was attending was more focused on kind of economics education. I was thinking of studying economics later on. But there was this one program that I found in Germany at the University of Bayreuth. They offered a degree called philosophy and economics. And I was like, oh, that's great. Now I could do both. I wouldn't have to end up unemployed, perhaps. So um, that might work nicely. And so I ended up going there, and it was a great program. It was very integrated, asking the kind of philosophical questions many would like to perhaps think about in an economics degree, thinking about perhaps issues of justice, issues of how do models work, and so forth, methodological questions. But then I also read more literature on the kind of psychological side, because many people are interested in um, yeah, what are perhaps the psychological or the causal mechanisms behind our economic decisions? But really, in economics, that's not really that much of a focus. I mean, behavioral economics is really interesting to me, neuroeconomics, game theory, and so forth. But I got more and more interested in biology. I read the work of people like Dan Dennett, Alex Rosenberg. Um, Alex Rosenberg stands out in particular because he wrote perhaps the first kind of an analytic style philosopher of science that was writing on the philosophy of economics, but he was very dissatisfied because no economist would pay attention to what he had to say. But then he went to the philosophy of biology and he said, well, it's a wonderful field here because biologists actually care about what you're writing.
Yeah.
And that both gave me a sense of, okay, philosophy of biology perhaps is much more rewarding as a kind of intellectual activity to do, but also this transition is something that is perhaps possible. And so I went to Bristol, where they also offered a kind of unique program, a master program in philosophy of biological and cognitive sciences. A very strange name, but exactly what I was looking for, because I wanted to understand the both biological and psychological factors that go into economic decision making, agency, and so forth. And eventually, that brought me to do a PhD in Sydney and think much more about this side of the mind. And you might have seen this in my book. Economics does play a bit of a role there.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
might talk
I was
about
gonna
that
say,
later.
so it's kind of funny as you're talking about this background, like, oh wait, like I know you mentioned so neuroeconomics especially stood out to me when there are a couple of places in your book where you mentioned it because that's what I did my PhD in.
Hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of kind of alignment here in terms of interests because I'm also very interested in the idea of like, oh, how do these decisions get made? Because it feels very, to me, close to all of these philosophical questions like free will and agency, like the some of the big questions, like what kind of creatures are we? Well, a big part of what we are is the decisions that we make, and so to me, the
Yeah.
like answering fundamental questions about the mechanisms behind that gets us closer to really understanding what we are. So yeah, it's very, very cool that you have that kind of economics background and that kind of led you in the philosophy direction as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's harder to pivot into neuroscience with an economics degree, but um, that's
um,
something I'm very much
I was
interested in.
I don't even know how they ended up letting me into neuroscience because I was like computer science and then philosophy and then somehow they let me do a third thing and
Oh,
so
it's great. Yeah.
was neuroscience. Um, but so that's gives a great kind of background on your kind of academic pedigree and interests. And I'm kind of curious. So I mean, you mentioned a couple of names, Dennett and Rosenberg, and you have in a few places mentioned like taking a naturalistic approach
Mm.
philosophy. And that's come with a kind of criticism or at least pessimism about analytical philosophy. So, how do you kind of see the two differing, and what do you think is kind of uh, what are you pessimistic about with analytic
Yeah.
philosophy? Why?
That's
Why
a
are you?
great question. Um, for many analytic philosophers, when they hear about the kind of naturalistic work some philosophers choose to do, they think of it as a kind of offspring of what comes out of Quine and other philosophers inspired perhaps by Sellars and so forth. Just philosophers who are interested in incorporating insights from science within their philosophical theorizing. But in that sense, it's then often still seen as part of the analytic tradition. And historically, there's certainly some connection there. I'm not going to deny that. After all, new theoretical traditions don't just pop into existence. I mean, people do have their doctoral supervisors and so forth, but that doesn't mean they necessarily adopt the very same methodology. And so, even when you look at Quine, who is often seen among philosophers as this kind of archetype of a naturalist philosopher who's going against the distinction, um, a bit of a priori, posteriori knowledge. He thinks logic itself can be revised in terms of perhaps insights from science. There's no hard dividing line here between what we might engage in philosophical theorizing and so forth and scientific theorizing. Um, Quine did, in fact, not draw on the sciences very much, right? And so, um, despite all of his interesting work, it's really just with people like Dennett that then really started to look at the science, that really followed the dictum. Of course, look, if philosophy is meant to actually be continuous with the sciences, well, then we have to do actual serious work and reading a lot of scientific literature and try to incorporate that in a serious way, not strawman it, really try to understand it well. And so the philosopher um, almost becomes disconnected to some extent here with traditional work in philosophy because you have to learn so much about science. Say if you want to write about say free will, you have to learn a lot about neuroscience, and this will bring you closer together with a lot of neuroscientists, but it also will create a bit of a disconnect between yourself and what goes on in traditional analytic philosophy of mind, which sometimes has seen itself as so disconnected that really um, any empirical findings coming out of neuroscience or more generally the cognitive sciences could be seen as irrelevant to the philosophy of mind. And that just struck me as such a strange position to hold. There's this independent discipline of the philosophy of mind, and we do our own thing. And then there's the sciences of the mind, but there's no bridging going on. And that just struck me as inherently misguided. We can go into the reasons for that more. But I think for many people listening here, I think that it will also struck them as strange to think that the sciences have nothing to contribute to understanding phenomena like consciousness, free will, memory, and the like, what it's like to be us. And science really illuminates a lot of the philosophical questions we've been asking for hundreds, thousands of years, really.
Yeah, and so, I wanna try to, like, put a finger on like, I've been asked before, like, "Oh, what is, like, a naturalist approach to philosophy? Like, what is the
Yeah.
distinguishing feature?" And you just said a couple of things, and I just wanna kinda, like, put a finger on it. So one is, like, the rejection of the distinction between, kind of a priori, reasoning and, uh, post priori?
Consider, yeah.
Reasoning. So like, you can't just like be in an armchair and find out things about the world. Like you kind of like they go together in some way. And that, I guess, as an implication of that, there's uh, not this kind of solid wall between philosophy as a sit and think deeply about
Hmm.
things and a go out into the world science like figure things out kind of distinction. Is that like the right way that you would conceptualize like what naturalist philosophy is all about? Is
Yeah. You can think about it a bit historically, where you see as the sciences rapidly proliferated, became more and more successful, especially the rise of psychology and neuroscience. I mean, that really pushed forth an idea of, look, I mean, philosophy of mind used to be this incredibly important field, but suddenly the science emerges that aims to answer philosophical question. You have William James, really, as a starting out as the father of psychology, who was also a philosopher, where if you look at the history of the emergence of sciences, often before they become sophisticated sciences, they're seen as part of philosophy. I mean, for Aristotle, for instance, he wrote these treatises trying to collect a lot of data about biology, creating his own taxonomies, and he's often sometimes seen as a father of biology. And similarly, here then the question arises, well, what role remains for philosophy? And one thing philosophers did is to say, look, we have different questions we're interested in. And for a naturalist philosopher, I would deny that, right? Neuroscientists are actually interested in these philosophical questions, and they're not just making a category error by trying to understand questions like trying to understand what is free will, what is the self, what is consciousness. No, they actually have useful tools to answer them. And so the questions, I don't really care too much about trying to draw a dividing line, because as a naturalist philosopher, science and philosophy are continuous. And so I am not very interested in trying to say, no, this is a true philosophical question. This is a scientific question. That is something for people who want to perhaps argue against a very strongly naturalist
yeah,
philosophy. And so, really, then, when it comes to distinguishing scientists from philosophers, it's more of a distinction of what are the methods people use.
right.
Um, and so the same is true for me. I mean, obviously, I'm drawing on less own experimental work than a scientist would. I draw more on meta-analysis. I read the scientific literature on what the experiments are. I engage with scientists, sometimes collaborating on research. Um, and you can think of naturalist philosophy here in the style I commit myself to as a kind of abstract science, trying to take a step back, look at what the research is that is happening across the cognitive sciences, for instance, and try to draw the empirical evidence together in order to make progress on these important philosophical questions.
Yeah. Um, that that's great. And one way that I sometimes think about, you know, what is a philosopher of biology or philosopher of
Mm,
neuroscience? Because within science, you have the experimentalists, the ones like actually in the wet lab, poking and prodding things and collecting data. But then you also have to figure out what experiment you're going to do. You do some kind of theorizing, right?
mm,
So it's not all just poking and prodding. There's also, thinking about what's the theory that ties all of this together. What are the implications of that theory, so that I can go and do my experiment.
right, right.
And then there's, going a step further in that direction, being really explicit about the theories by building theoretical models, so like computational models, mathematical models that give really precise predictions. And so, like within the sciences, you'll often have this kind of continuum of people that are lean more on the experimental side, lean more on the theoretical side, and then I kind of see philosophers as like, oh yeah, they're like a step a little bit further on the theoretical side compared
Mm.
to what you would normally consider like the theoretical
No,
side
that's
of
right. I mean,
the
I actually had an internship during my undergrad at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology.
Oh, very cool.
I
Yeah.
had a group for mathematical biology, and it was really very interested in these philosophical questions. They gave me books by Samir Kasha, who was my supervisor in Bristol, and a book by Peter Godfrey Smith, who then ended up being one of my supervisors in Sydney. Really, and that surprised me in a sense. I mean, I knew that biologists would be more open, perhaps, to the work of biologists, philosophers of biology. But here, really, they had these books. They were reading them in order to think about what are the best models we should build in order to make progress on these questions. So philosophy really had an important role to play here.
Yeah.
Um, and some philosophers have this attitude: it doesn't matter if scientists listen to what we write, what we say, and so forth. And that struck me as very strange. Why would you want to do philosophy of a particular field of science that then none of the scientists working on that field find valuable? That I don't know. That doesn't strike me as particularly useful.
Yeah, actually, our the Cognitive Wonderland book club is currently reading Metazoa by
Mm.
Smith. So it was cool while I was reading your book, realizing, oh, hey, you have this connection to Peter. So that's very cool. Um, so at this point, let's like you have had some. I think because you're coming from this very naturalistic angle, have had some kind of choice words for uh, various more speculative metaphysics, particularly metaphysics that, like you said, like don't have an implication for the sciences. Um, so I know you've kind of written very positive things about Ladyman's critique of metaphysics.
Mm.
Everything must go, and a response that many might have to that is, well, you're just adopting one metaphysic, like among many possible options. Why should you be dismissive of the metaphysics as a endeavor if your whole argument for it is arguing at the metaphysical level and then adopting one is how one might characterize it. So I wonder if you could speak to that concern.
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, in part, my motivation to write that blog post came out of discussions about speculative philosophy of mind in particular, panpsychism, but also a bit dualism and idealism, which you see a bit of a revival in terms of philosophy. And for naturalist philosophers, that strikes us a bit as unfortunate because for us, we want to see philosophy more like the sciences, where we continue to make progress, develop stronger theories, try to integrate new evidence, make them stronger and stronger. But the academic model of philosophy is a bit different, where, let's say, you want to publish a paper on materialism, right? unfortunate fact is there's not that much new things to say because so many people have tried to develop in a very serious manner. And for some theories that have a smaller number of adherents, that is not true. Some theories are just less well developed. And so there's more to say, there's more you can do to improve them. And so it's one of the reasons in philosophy you see a kind of proliferation, at least recently, because our norms have changed to embrace more pluralism. And to some extent, I think that's very positive. I mean, go back 50 years, and philosophers used to be perhaps the most hostile people in academia. You give a talk, and people would stand up and say, well, this is a terrible argument for these and these reasons, and so forth. Was a very hostile environment you would have had in the past. Now philosophy is much more pluralistic. We try to broaden the horizon of all the possible views out there. And that's valuable because, of course, I mean, you need to know what the available views are in order to decide, well, what's the best one there. And now when it comes to naturalist philosophy, sometimes you hear this argument coming against analytic metaphysics. Well, you mentioned it's just one metaphysics I'm choosing here. And that's why I'm defending a particular style of naturalist philosophy, materialism, and so forth. But that's a mistake because it assumes that a priori a commitment is made towards a particular view in metaphysics. But of course, that would be very strange to do for naturalist philosophers. Nevertheless, that's what happens with philosophers like, say, Philip Goff. They are engaged in a kind of a priori metaphysics where they're thinking about, well, how can we think about consciousness, say, from this a priori perspective? We engage in introspection. What does consciousness appear like to myself? And based on that, a new metaphysics is built. And that's, of course, strikingly different from taking an opposite approach and looking more broadly at everything that comes out of the sciences, which often, very often, in fact, probably the majority of the time, goes against what intuition tells us. If we introspect, say, into how biological systems work, we might have thought, oh, well, probably there's some vital spark in living creatures that makes them move, something like a soul that is infused in them, and without that, there's just machinery. That doesn't turn out to really be how it is. And same for chemistry, physics, a lot of the laws we have. If you try to study physics in university, it's really counterintuitive. I mean, you have to really stop thinking about, well, how can I make intuitive sense of these equations to me and myself? No, you have to learn this mathematical language, a very different way of thinking about the world that can often be quite puzzling. And of course, we didn't evolve to think in terms of equations, really. And so it is harder for some, easier for others. And so when it comes to the kind of naturalist metaphysics that I'm interested in, it's really an inference to the best explanation. We start from the successful phenomena in science, and that doesn't exclude our own experiences. We have, when we go back to the philosopher Wilfred Seller, we have these scientific images created by the various scientific disciplines, but we also have this manifest image, the kind of categories, the concepts we use in our ordinary life. We engage with others, we think with others. We don't usually think in terms of the categories we've learned from the sciences. Sometimes manifest image concepts are updated and so forth, where that is useful. But the manifest image is often the kind of most shorthand, easiest concepts for ordinary use. And that still reflects what philosophers like Dan Dennett would call a real pattern. It reflects something real out there in nature. It's not inherently reductionist in the sense that, everything has to be explained in terms of physics. Not as reality to the successful models we have. And that's something interesting to explain and so forth. But really then, how one should think about metaphysics is a kind of, well, based on all these successful models, and I use models quite broadly here, theories and so forth, what is the best metaphysics that accommodates that, rather than really have an opposite approach where you start with a priori analytic metaphysics and think about, well, in an armchair, we can think about what the structure of reality would be like, the kind of logical categories, and then science has to be accommodated to that rather than the other way around. And so really, I think that nicely perhaps gives an emphasis of why naturalist philosophy is, um, at least in the sense I use the term, is quite different from analytic philosophy.
Yeah.
It's really an opposite approach.
Yeah. Thanks. That's really helpful. And if I can, like, I don't know if this is pushing back, but maybe giving a I don't know if I'm playing devil's advocate or saying what I really believe here, but um, so you mentioned like the manifest image versus the more scientific image of the world, and how the manifest image you mentioned sometimes gets updated by
Yeah.
our concepts. Um, Now, one thing that I um, uh, have taken from philosophy of science is the theory ladenness of our observations. So when you see something, make some observation in the world, it doesn't totally eliminate alternative theories. It tends to more just, it might make that theory a little bit hard. You have something that you need to explain, and so it might be a little bit of a challenge to the theory, but it doesn't eliminate them. And so if you really want to save a theory, you kind of always can. And what that suggests to me is that there's sort of this uh, you can't do things totally a priori, because I agree with you. Observation is really important, but observation can change our concepts and ways of thinking about the world, change our theories, and then thinking about our theories can also kind of seeing how they cohere can change things. And so I kind of see push and pull between those two. Um, to pull up by its bootstraps our image of the world, rather than a take the empirical stuff first and then like fit the philosophy to that. Not that I'm saying that that's
Mm.
exactly what you're saying, but I'm just curious. I agree with you. Like, yeah, we don't want to just sit in an armchair, but in some sense, I feel like that's not what the philosophers might think that the analytic philosophers would think that they're doing. They're saying, well, like, look, we want to make sure everything that philosophy is saying, or everything that science is saying, that we are consistent with that. But then we have a job of taking those concepts and exploring this big potential world of theories and putting forth which ones seem most coherent given those. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, I'm
I
curious.
mean, one thing to say here, for instance, is that consistency is quite weak as a criterion. So naturalism as a term in philosophy has become quite deflated because at least a few decades ago, it would have been a pretty negative thing to say you're non-naturalist philosopher. I mean, there were always some, right? Perhaps you can see surveys like on Phil People. We occasionally do surveys of the philosophy community. Maybe get something like 30% saying they're non-naturalists. But when you ask people what they mean by naturalism, it's often very deflated in the sense of, well, I don't believe in supernatural entities, right? Spirits and the like. And that's quite weak. So the sense I use naturalist philosophy is more than just consistency with science, right? Um, because you could make a lot of claims that are in principle compatible. I mean, in scientific theorizing, for instance, if you postulate entities, that's in principle perhaps compatible, but in model building, there's many criteria you have for what makes a successful model. One might be simplicity and so forth. Is there any explanatory power to the entities you postulate? Um, and so metaphysics, as I see it, it's not entirely abandoned. You should rethink of it as, rather than uncovering these unquestionable categories of nature, as a kind of highly general model building.
Mm,
Okay?
yeah.
And so in the philosophy of science literature, um, in at least I've recently written this book on modeling evolution, and one of the things I've highlighted there, because it was aimed at least a little bit to be introductory to people who haven't read much in the philosophy of modeling at all, to say nothing really. So, and one crucial thing there is that different models have trade-offs. Right? One model isn't inherently perhaps better according to just one dimension. No, there's many questions you could ask about what you want from particular models. And one kind of three factors you might think about is realism, simplicity, and predictive power, for instance, where or generality, for instance, and you can add more and more, but the problem is you can't maximize all of them. Sometimes in order to make one model perhaps as powerful in terms of prediction, it can't be as general, because you can't have this model that suddenly predicts everything in all these other domains.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you make your model more narrow, can actually be more valuable. But if you're not too familiar with the philosophy of science, you might think, oh, well, we're just trying to seek more general models.
Right.
But that's not always true. Often in science, we actually try to get more narrow, try to have a huge variety of very targeted models for particular phenomena you might be interested in. And generality can be very useful. But if you think of philosophy or metaphysics as trying to maximize generality, which I think metaphysicians are usually trying to do, well, then you're trading off both predictive power, right? The connection to the real world becomes minimized, because whatever you say here doesn't seem to have much of an impact on what the perhaps practical work of scientists might be, or even people thinking about the world in the ordinary discourse with others. And also, um, realism suffers as you make these models more and more general. I like to make this comparison to a claim attributed to Thales that everything is water, right? It's a very general claim, but both lacks clearly any predictive or explanatory power, and also doesn't strike us as really capturing the value of realism. It doesn't really strike us as capturing the
What do you mean by
fundamental.
realism? Like, can you give me an example of a theory that goes
Great.
well
So
on
you might
realism?
think of models being more abstract. Think of economic models, perhaps, where sometimes or very often people demand that economic models should be more realistic. They should include more variables from the real world. Try to make the hypothetical rational agents more like the irrational agents in the real world. But it actually turns out that sometimes including more variables from the real world makes the models worse in terms of both predictive power as well as generality. And so sometimes trying to increase realism doesn't actually make the models better for the purposes they're put to use. Say, in order to decide which, I don't know, tax policy you might have, or trying to solve the housing crisis or something along those lines. Sometimes, and that's very counterintuitive, right? Sometimes the unrealistic models are more useful. They better predict what is going to happen.
Right. And so is this related to like the concept of overfitting in like statistical modeling? Is that the
Yeah,
way to
that's
think
right.
of it?
And in statistics more generally, you also have a lot of these discussions as well. And I think there's a lot of parallels you could draw to metaphysics. In fact, I think there's a lot of valuable work to be done here. I think we could try to develop these ideas much further. Um, some philosophers have taken up the idea that metaphysics could be seen as modeling. But I don't think they've really strongly adopted the methodology of model builders, trying to learn from how scientists are creating models, and that there's genuine trade-offs, and that it's not just about having this one model that does everything, which it seems like more that metaphysicists are interested in, and really have more of a broader set of models for particular intended purposes.
Mhm.
And really then I think metaphysics just suffers from trying to maximize generality at the cost of explanatory power, predictive power, realism. It seems utterly disconnected. And so even if it is very general, think of Thales. If everything is water, I mean, it doesn't help do much, unfortunately. And that would be a negative.
Yeah, and so to bring this to like a specific metaphysic, so like you mentioned Philip Goff and panpsychism earlier, and imagine what he would say if all of this was posed to him was, well, yeah, we want a theory that has all of these virtues, but it also needs to actually explain stuff, and the thing that can't be explained by physicalism is consciousness, you know, the subjective qualia
Yeah.
uh, experience. And so, in the way he's kind of conceptualizing this, that is a um, piece of data. Our subjective experience is a piece of data that needs to be explained by the theory. And so, I'm curious how you would kind of respond to that. Like, what's wrong with that kind of approach in your
Yeah, I
book?
mean, Dennett similarly said, look, we're not ignoring this data from our own experiences. He called it heterophenomenology. It's just seen as part of the data, right? Comes together with all the other data we get from neuroscience, psychology, and so forth. Um, and it's just not treated as this, as perhaps giving us insights into unquestionable axioms. And that's a problem. You might have seen how the integrated information theory of consciousness has received this public criticism where maybe over 100 scientists, I think it was probably less, but got together as well as philosophers calling it pseudoscience because it relied very strongly on these axioms. It just declared to be fundamental based on introspection. And many of them could be questioned. And I've done so in my book, for
Yeah,
instance, that a lot of these intuitions we have about what consciousness must be like um, really at most perhaps get us at what seems like a very common feature to human experience, but then not even shared across all humans. But when we think about consciousness as this broader natural phenomenon, it's very plausible that it appears in these very different forms. And that is a very different way of solving the problem of consciousness than trying to say, look, let's say it's fundamental. And then instead of thinking of how it could have gradually emerged, we think about it in a panpsychist approach. Well, perhaps then these fundamental properties must have been there from the beginning because it's hard to think about how they could have gradually emerged,
right.
how they could have been intermediate steps. And so it's a very different model of explaining it.
Yeah, so let's dig in a little bit into your kind of views on consciousness because I thought your book was a really interesting read. I haven't seen somebody uh, explore in such an explicit way, breaking down consciousness in the way that your book does. So I think this came from uh, another researcher, Birch et al., had this framework for thinking about animal consciousness, where there's actually a whole bunch of dimensions. It's not just like, oh, things are conscious or not, but there's a whole bunch of different dimensions. And on each of those dimensions, it's more of a gradient rather than a binary on and off. And of course, this lends itself much better to this evolutionary story because
Hmm.
uh, everything's a little bit gradual, and you have multiple things that can be gradual, and so it's a little bit easier to imagine how a gradual process like evolution could bring it about. So could you like just give us the high level overview of like what are these different dimensions and why is this how you would approach thinking about
That's
consciousness?
right. So to start with, it's not that I'm saying there's just these five dimensions. And Birch et al. I don't really think so either. What they try to do is look at some human literature where we've started to move away from just asking whether humans are conscious or non-conscious. Think of, say, patients in a coma, where you get these responses that are hard to interpret. And rather than think in terms of an either on or off matter, you think of, well, they could be scored according to these different dimensions. We could categorize them, whether they are perhaps part of this category or this category. And it's very natural to think then when you think about animals that the same could be done, right? And this has already been done when it came to self-awareness. There's been this really interesting research where fishes have been able to show self-awareness in terms of recognizing themselves in a mirror and spots and use the environment, which a lot of animals with much larger brains failed to do. And so you can see self-awareness, selfhood, as perhaps one of the dimensions of consciousness that people in the public very commonly associate with consciousness. That consciousness isn't just the having any kind of subjective experience as something it feels like to be in a state, but consciousness seen as a more complex state. Some think of it perhaps as unique to humans, involving a high degree of metacognition, a high level of intelligence, where you think of yourself as an experiencing subject, right? This kind of meta level awareness. But that's people stop to think about consciousness in the philosophical literature about that, and also scientists have moved away from that. But self-awareness certainly then is one. Is there a sense of self? And we could distinguish that in many ways. At the most minimal level, you might think of it as, well, can an organism distinguish itself from the outside world? Right? And that's plausibly very basic. I mean, bacteria can do that, but perhaps not in the sense that they have an experience of a self, right? There's a distinction that has to be made between a kind of information processing that can be done completely non-consciously, and nevertheless, of course, it makes sense to think, well, at some point, as these cognitive capacities become more complex, plausibly subjective experience enters the scene. And there's four other dimensions: evaluative experience, emotions, mood, and the like, things feel good or bad. The sensory side of experience, seeing things as blue, the world of sounds, electrosensing, snakes, and the like. We're not the only ones with perhaps weird sensory ability. Other animals have them as well. I mean, obviously, bats have echolocation and so forth. And then two further ones that Birch et al. Tried to look at, which was the kind of temporal aspects of experience. They call it temporality. I called it diachronic unity, and that is how unified are our experiences across time. And then you can distinguish that from synchronic unity, of how integrated are our experiences in any moment. And for the integrated information theory, they declare unity to be this fundamental property of consciousness. Whereas I say, well, even in human cases, when you have cases like split brain patients or animals where the brain halves are far less connected, with a lot of specialization of labor, where you get animals that can engage in unihemispheric sleep, where one half of the brain is sleeping, perhaps even dreaming. It's an open question, of course, while the other part of the brain is still active and the animal is still able to engage with the outside world, maybe swim or fly. And so these five dimensions are, I think, five important distinctions we can draw, but we could make more distinctions. So theory of mind was here included in selfhood, but plausibly we could disassociate that, whether you're able to think of the experiences of others, perhaps modeling them based on your own experiences, what you think their experiences might be like, and so forth. And then if you score this across animals, you get a very diverse picture, where some animals will suddenly turn out to be perhaps more conscious along those dimensions than us. So rather than thinking of consciousness perhaps as the single scale where humans are at the top, animals could actually outrank us in many of these dimensions. And when I speak to the public, I certainly mention cases like, well, you might think of dogs, clearly the sense of smell, more conscious than ours, right? Some of these sensory abilities we don't even have. So obviously, animals could perhaps outcompete us here. Elephants have much richer memory capacities than us. And so their sense of self across time might be stronger than ours, right? And that gives us a much more diverse picture of consciousness that almost tears it apart Although I don't quite want to say that consciousness isn't real and it's just these many different things.
Would
But
you
it's
say it's more
certainly,
like one of Dennett's real patterns? Is that
it just tears at the idea that that consciousness is a single thing with these certain identifiable attributes that all must be there, and it gives you a much more diverse and much more complex picture. Which, to be fair, it would be perhaps more palatable if there was an easy answer, right? Um, and to some extent, I think panpsychism is perhaps tempting in this sense because it seems to suggest it's an easy answer. Or it how always has been there. It's these fundamental properties rather than this very complex picture where you would actually want to explain all these various dimensions. They all require very complex scientific reasoning and so forth, and a lot of data in order to be explained. And once we make progress on all of these, the question of why there's any experience at all will no longer be as mysterious.
so? I want to push a little bit on the bit that you said about uh, like bacteria can do many of these things, but we don't think of them as conscious.
Hmm.
It's kind of a certain amount of complexity for that. Like, how do you think about that line? Like, why would just adding more complexity kind of give give you this
Right.
additional thing that we term experience?
Yeah. I mean, in my book, I call the central idea the pathological complexity thesis. And one of the ideas was, look, we want to distinguish genuine differences, genuine major transitions in agency. Because I think there's a valuable literature looking at bacteria and plants, for instance, showing that they're much more intelligent and behaviorally sophisticated than was once assumed, perhaps in part due to philosophers who tried to have these very categorical distinctions of minds and non-minds. Um, but part of the problem is that then some of the people defending plant intelligence and so forth make an opposite mistake where they don't distinguish any gradations anymore, and that's important, right? If you compare the agency of a bacteria to a human, clearly there's an incredible difference. I like a Levantin quote that I use in the book where he talks about um, Darwinism needing to include now not just the object, but also the subject in evolution. And I think that's quite important, where if you think about evolutionary processes, originally, the kind of first self replicating particles, there's very little agency, subject likeness. I don't mean it in the sense of subjective experience, but there's really no sense of these replicating entities as being described as subject in any sense, right? A lot of these Darwinian properties, I write about this in my work in evolutionary biology, they're almost environmentally, exogenously provided. And it depends very much on the environment in order for these properties to be induced. And it's only later, over really millions of years, that these properties become more intrinsic to the systems, right? Um, and so when you look at bacteria, they have agency, yes. But if you want to think about agency as a kind of scale, then you might place bacteria somewhere over here. Yes, there's a little bit of agency. A stone, zero. Humans, much more. Maybe AI systems also have some agency, depending on which ones you look at. And similarly, then if you think about these particular phenomena you might be interested in, such as evaluation or sensing, much more rudimentary in these cases. And the question then is, well, under which conditions would you expect more complex forms of evaluative cognition that might give rise to subjective experience? And that's where I bring in the pathological complexity thesis. We want to think about common currency that would give you this kind of, I mean, you've worked in neuroeconomics. We want to find the neural utility, a kind of real phenomenon where the values of alternative actions or outcomes are compared against each other, giving organisms something like a subjective point of view, in a sense. And that's where I try to locate the very origins of consciousness, because it's easy to think about, yeah, maybe artificial systems as having some kind of experiences, uh, really hard to test though. But when it comes to biological systems, there's very little sense to have subjective experiences unless these experiences tie back to the success of the organism in terms of higher reproductive success. And in order to have that success, it must have an influence on the actions. I mean, I think very few people think consciousness will have an impact on, say, the immune system or um, more generally physiological factors. What really is important is behavior, action. And that's where consciousness has to play a role, which is why I argue that evaluation is so central here.
Yeah, and so one thing that kind of struck me as I was reading your argument for the centrality of valence and evaluation for as kind of you see it as the kernel upon which consciousness comes about, um, is that like I could imagine somebody who, for example, is into integrated information theory or some other um, vision of what consciousness is, thinking from our human point of view, where our experience has all these different dimensions that you have, and say, well, like, okay, evaluation and valence, that might be like a requirement for consciousness, but I think it don't like we should only actually use that term once you have certain forms of unity. Like only at that point do we really does it
Yeah,
deserve the title of consciousness. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you think, um, like, do you have an argument against that, or to what extent is this just kind of a definitional thing? Like, we need to, once we kind of have a better idea of how to break it apart, decide, okay, how much of this stuff do you need for us to like agree that yes, this deserves the label consciousness?
great. The one answer I mean I give in the book is, if you think of unity less as an either you have it or you don't matter, but something that can come in degrees,
Mm,
then when you have something like evaluative, a balanced experience, that will automatically give you a sense of unity, because it will tie together um, various areas of the brain that are processing information in order to present information in a useful way, in order to make these systems, yes, work more together. So there is some unity, and so I could happily endorse that claim
mm,
without saying, well, unity is this strong prerequisite where brain must be very centrally organized, almost in the sense of kind of, yeah, Cartesian theater where everything necessarily has to come together. No, no, you can have trade offs, you can have a lot of parallel processing, and consciousness then is less like the central star, but just one player among many. Well, and it's us, of course. I mean, why would we want to think, well, we are just part of the show? We would like to think that we are the ones running things, right? I mean, it does tear a bit on our sense of self, perhaps on our sense of pride, as agents in the world. That yeah, we perhaps have less to do with the success, as a lot of the non-conscious processing going on in the background, most of the information processing going on in the brain. A lot of this data we get from neuroscience is really surprising, and undermines a lot of traditional ideas of what we might have thought about what the mind is like, or the self, and so forth. Um, but I think we can accommodate some of these intuitions without discarding them completely, without perhaps making them too axiomatic and being too dogmatic about them.
interesting. And so, when it comes to like thinking about, so I think one reason that we talk about consciousness and care about this as a topic, obviously, it's just like an interesting puzzle. Like, what the heck
Mm.
is this thing? But another is, of course, the kind of ethical implications of it. So people talk about like, are AI agents conscious? Because of course that would be have big implications for how we're using them if we decide like, yeah, these what we do with them has ethical implications, and then of course animals, how we treat them. This has a huge impact on that. So I'm wondering how you see your view of consciousness kind of influencing and how that shapes your view on the other.
Great. I mean, yeah, in my book, I make reference to Dennett's distinctions between yeah, for instance, Gregorian creatures or Skinnerian creatures, and I introduce a new term I call Benthamite creatures. People might be familiar with Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, and he was a strong defender of animal rights, where he argued, look, what matters for an entity to be given moral subjecthood, to be a matter of concern, is whether they have sentience, whether they have the capacity to have pleasurable and painful experiences. And when do these entities emerge in evolutionary history? Well, I argue it's plausibly around the Cambrian, 540 million years ago, because as you got these multicellular animals emerging with more complex bodies, more complex appendages, being able to engage with the world, moving around, that gives you this very high pathological complexity. Pathological complexity can be understood as the trade-offs organisms have to deal with. You have many more actions available. How do you make decisions about these trade-offs? And here common currency is very useful. And then when it comes to AI systems, we of course have the problem, firstly, that they're not designed by evolution. Perhaps we could design them in completely different ways that perhaps would give them experiences without any evaluation. And I try to steer a bit of a middle ground here, where I argue, look, it's plausible that AI systems might also require this kind of evaluation to have experience, that perhaps there is something to experience. And I do draw, in fact, on some psychological data, experimental philosophy work that has been done trying to ask hundreds of ordinary members of the public, not philosophers who have become perhaps indoctrinated by how we might think about consciousness, qualia, what they think is central to experience. And for a lot of people, they think, yeah, evaluation seems like a central thing. And so the ethical and the philosophy of mind issues seem to converge then here strongly, because if you think, well, these systems have an experience to their evaluation, things feel good and bad for them, well, then it seems we can say that these systems, there's also a sense in which they can be harmed, in which they can be benefited.
Yeah.
Right? And in the AI case, clearly that's very difficult to determine. I've recently written a paper that was published defending sentientism, because some people like David Chalmers tried to move away from sentience. They've argued, well, any kind of subjective experience, even if it's just the experience of blue, would also give moral status to an entity. And I've argued against this. I think it's very unclear what it would mean for such an entity to be harmed or benefited if all you can experience is blue. If you take away all evaluations I would have, it's very hard for me to imagine, for instance, how I could be harmed, really.
Yeah. So I think this segues well into what I wanted to ask as kind of my last question here, and we're running low on time. So I'm curious how you would respond to sort of the if someone was to challenge you with the hard problem and say, hey, like all this stuff that you're talking about, this ability to evaluate, I can imagine all that happening without there being an actual feeling behind it. Why would performing this function give you the kind of subjective experience, the what it's likeness that we know we have as conscious entities? How does the structure and form, the function, give you this qualitative thing?
Good. I mean, I introduced one term before, inference to the best explanation. And one demand you might think people are making in saying this to people defending particular theories of consciousness is that they want some categorical argument that consciousness must be involved in such cases, right? Going perhaps back to my criticisms earlier against analytic metaphysics, where what is important is, well, we have a range of available theories, and we must think about, well, what is perhaps the best explanation we have? I mean, you might choose a kind of quietism, you might decide to be silent on the issues. I'm not too much of a fan of that. Usually I prefer to examine what are the available views and just, well, unless they're all sort of equally valuable, which I don't think in this case. There's plenty of evidence available that makes some theories very unlikely to be true, and other theories much more in line with the empirical data we have, even in reflecting our own subjective experiences. And so when it comes to the hard problem, I think the demand for one that consciousness must be involved in a case um, doesn't necessarily have to be met with an answer. I could imagine that we build sometimes a system, perhaps in the case of AIs, that could do things in a different manner, but be successful in the same way. Solve the problem of pathological complexity, for instance, with a new mechanism that's perhaps more efficient. Um, I mean, biology is far more creative than most of us. I like that when evolutionary biologists like Dawkins point that out, right? You might imagine an ingenious solution, but blind chance with millions of years to experiment often comes up with much better solutions than even the best human engineers, that even with a lot of creativity. Um, and so it's not implausible to me to think that in the history of evolution, if you replay the tape, that perhaps a different solution could have been found. However, as you in your research in neuroeconomics probably also learned, there does seem to be something quite central to requiring something like a common currency for evaluation. And now perhaps a common currency could be instantiated in an non-conscious manner. I don't think that's impossible inherently. I mean, otherwise I would have to commit myself to some a priori claim here. I mean, I don't have that empirical data to be able to undermine that. It's just a matter of fact that in the history of life, a conscious solution to this was be found. And when we look at the research of what conscious experiences do in evaluation, it does seem like it's not just neutral. If something's consciously experienced, it will play a different role in terms of learning, in terms of calculating trade-offs, and so forth. And so it does appear that the experiential aspect isn't just some magical add-on that has zero functional role to play, but consciousness itself is functional. And so the distinction between the functional explanation of consciousness and the purely qualitative explanation of consciousness then aren't completely distinct. There is overlap here. And I think all of that then undermines a bit the idea that the hard problem is completely unassailable. And similarly, I mentioned the experiments of asking people about what they think are the central aspects of consciousness. Few think in terms of the philosophical notions of qualia and so forth. And I mentioned they think more in terms of evaluation and so forth. And so it does appear that when it comes to the kind of evaluative experience, there's less of an explanatory gap of why things would have to be experienced to be functionally useful. Whereas if you purely think about perhaps sensory experiences disconnected to evaluative decision making, I think the hard problem intuition is much more obvious. But that's typically what people think about. The color of blue, color of red. Why like that? Why not in any different way? But when it comes to evaluation, I think this problem is at least minimized.
Interesting. Well, great. So we're kind of at time here, but thank you so much. This has been really helpful for me. I loved our conversation here. For everybody watching, you should subscribe to Walter Veit. Try my German again, and buy his books and check them out. So yeah, thank you so much, and have a
Thanks
great
so
day.
much for having me. I'm sure we'll have another chat at some point in the future.
I'd love to. Actually, I hear you're going to be chatting with Joseph Foley. Is it next week? Which is funny because I talked to him last week, so we have like every combination of the three of us.
That's right.
Yeah, so great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. You too.